Hey, what's going on, guys and girls? I don't think I've ever introduced myself on my channel before, so my name's Mike and I'm an avid Balisong enthusiast. But today I'm gonna just jump right in and make a video that probably doesn't need to be made and has probably already been made before, but I want to make a video today comparing the differences between bushings and bearings on Balisongs. Now I know that is a heated point of contention among most members, especially from one member to another. You're going to find wildly different opinions on that particular subject, and I'm going to try and narrow down some of those differences today. Now, I had every intention on filming this video outside today, but as you can see, it's Mother Nature wasn't really feeling that plan, so this is about all we're going to get for outside filming. So let's get it going, guys. Alright, so now, you may be asking, what are bushings and bearings anyway? Now, there are multiple forms of each, but in the most fundamental description I can give, they're pivot systems for knives that allow for smooth, lubricated operation, but also allow for tight, fixed tolerances. Now, I've laid out a couple different knives here that both utilize bearings and bushings, and we're going to take a look at both of those. But to start, let's take a look at, first, an up-close look at bushings. Now, like bearings, bushings are a pivot system that will allow for tight tolerances and very little handle play, but also smooth operation. Now, the hole that's cut into the blade is cut to the size of the outside diameter of the bushing, and this bushing is set to be just maybe 1/1000th of an inch thicker than the blade. So what happens is when there's a washer on either side of the bushing and the blade, those washers will squeeze onto the bushing and not the blade, allowing the blade to swing back and forth with full smooth operation, but also allowing there to be very little handle play. Now that is when bushings are properly and effectively tuned, and we're going to get into some gripes I have about that also later on in this video. But this here is a properly good functioning bushing driven knife. Very little handle play. Now, for me at least, bushings and bearings, the key is to have no fucking blade rub. That's at least why I want to have bushings and bearings. I don't know about you guys, but if not only because of that, it is a major added benefit and almost required, especially if you're buying a modern flipping Bally in 2018. There's no fucking excuses. Now these are bearings. These are caged bearings, mind you. There are two different ways to do bearings in a Bally and in a folder, or any folding knife for that matter, but these here are caged bearings. The other style of doing bearings is called IKBS, and what that is there will be a race milled into the handle itself, and individual ball bearings will be sat in there with the depth of that race machined just a little bit thinner than the thickness of the bearings themselves, so this way those ball bearings ride against the blade and the inside of that race. Now these will typically sit in a pocket in the blade, and then the blade and the handles will clamp down onto the bearings, rolling in that race milled into the blade, allowing for, again, smooth operation and very, very little handle play. Now, a lot of guys do not like bearings. They say that they flip weird, and at first, yeah, they do flip a little bit weird, but I mean, it's not anything that like inhibits the, complete ability to flip, at least not for me. And I would much rather deal with you know, any wonkiness from bearings at the behest of zero handle play. Now, I think the thing that a lot of guys don't like when it comes to bearings is especially if they're done right. I mean, you can see there's just literally zero lateral resistance whatsoever. And that can make you know, some tricks go not the way you would expect, you know, because it just totally changes the dynamics of how the knife flips, especially when most bushing driven knives have a little bit of lateral resistance just because of the way the bushing sits in the hole of the blade when it's like, you know, doesn't have any inertia or g-force carrying the handles out, and it's just like sitting or swinging really slow in a lateral position. But that also makes flipping a bushing knife a little bit more predictable, at least in my opinion. Now, when it comes to bearings, I typically tend to notice, now this knife here did not come with bearings, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but anytime I buy a bearing driven knife, it typically comes out of the box. The pivots may need to be adjusted, you know, a quarter or a half a turn, but typically come with perfect tolerances and zero blade rub, and that's one of the big things I like about bearings. Now, I have gotten bushing driven knives, expensive bushing driven knives, mind you, like mid-techs that came with bushings that were just complete trash. And I'm going to put this down for a minute because we're going to talk about my qualms with mid-tech bushings. Now listen, if you're going to make a knife, a $500, $600, $700 Bali that's made to be flipped, and you're going to go so far as to put bushings in the knife, just tune them right. If you don't know how to do it, have somebody else do it. There are so many people in the community, you know, who can put out consistently perfectly tuned knives over and over and over again in a repeatable process. Now, if I'm buying a mid-tech knife that's supposed to have individualized personal attention given to each and every one, especially regarding the fit and finish, I shouldn't have to replace the bushings and put completely new ones in because the stock ones that came were just like totally out of whack. And that's happened to me more than once from the same maker, but on multiple different Balis from different makers. I don't want to just talk shit in this video, so that's all I'm gonna say about it, but that's my only qualm with bushings, is if you're gonna make a Bali, especially an expensive mid-tech Bali that has bushings, just please make sure they're tuned right, because it's really not all that hard. Because if I can buy a new set of bushings and tune them by feel without a good caliper and with one worn out piece of 1000 grit sandpaper to the proper dimensions that they need to be to allow for minimal handle play and no rub, no tap, and these are the ones that I fitted to this knife, because the ones that came in it were just cut entirely way too small. I mean, I couldn't even thumb tighten the Zen pin screws or the pivot screws without everything just binding up. And I tried to have it where like I had it held together with Loctite and Teflon tape for about a week, and I said fuck it, I just replaced the bushings, and it was potentially the best decision I had ever made with this knife, because I was so close to just flipping it and getting rid of it. But when I put new bushings in it, it totally transformed this knife. Changed the way, right down to the way it sounds. But that's all I'm gonna say about that when it comes to factory fit and finish and tuning of bushings, at least on the negative end, because there are makers like I had an Infinity that developed blade rub after a few months of flipping, and I used to have a standard 3.0 that also I bought secondhand but arrived with blade rub. Now this is from the latest Blade HQ drop, and it's got zero play, zero rub, zero tap. And while we're on this subject, Jerry Hom, every single knife he pumps out has perfect tolerances. And he is especially making a lot more knives than you know, some of these mid-techs I'm buying. So if these can be pumped out consistently with perfect tolerances every single time, then I don't think there's any excuse. There's no, you know, especially in 2018, even whether they're done by hand or not, there's no excuse for bushings not to be perfectly tuned. I mean, that's the whole purpose of going so far as to put bushings in a knife. Now, Jerry Hom with his bushings, he uses the same, like, pretty standard in Balisongs, but 3/16 inch pivots. But I know he uses a larger outside diameter bushing than BRS does or Beagler. Actually, that Konohishi has the same larger outside diameter bushings as Jerry uses, which just makes for more surface area and allows for tighter tolerances and is just all around better. Because this knife has had the fucking balls flipped out of it and is still pretty damn near perfect. Now back to bearings, because there are multiple ways to do bearings. There is the caged bearing that will typically sit in typically a milled pocket into the blade and ride against, in most cases, steel washers, so this way the bearings don't wear a race into the titanium, or IKBS style bearings, which I doubt you're going to be able to see, but there's a race milled into the handle slabs, and there are individual bearings sitting in that race rolling against the blade. Now, I had Ben Parley mod those bearings into this knife because this used to have just standard basic washer pivots, which is just the pivot put through the blade with a washer on either side, and the tolerance is directly related to how tight you have the pivot screw. So just a tiny bit too tight and everything's going to bind up and it's not going to flip. But the advantage of having bearings is that rattle is just the latch pin sitting in the handles, but allows for zero handle play and completely smooth operation. Now that is ultimately what I'm going for in a Bali. Whether it has bearings or bushings, I don't really care either way. I'm not partial to either one, as long as they are smooth and allow for smooth operation and as little play as possible. Some guys like to flip Balis and like to have that slop and play. I personally don't. I want as little play as is humanly possible. And I don't care if it's bearings or bushings that get me there. I'm not partial either way. Although that is a heated point of contention in this community. Not heated, I wouldn't say, but the norm is that people like bushings more than bearings. Now, I could care less either way. As long as it operates perfectly the way it's supposed to for a modern Bali, spending what we are in 2018, they should be perfect. Now, I don't mind replacing bushings or lapping down thrust washers, let's say, because this is the only bearing Bali, the Max Ace Pelican, I've gotten that really needed to be fucked with out of the box. That was bearings. And the problem with that was that being channel titanium handles and bearings, the tolerances for all the parts in the pivots had to be nearly perfect for the Bali to operate perfectly as well. And the thrust washers they initially had machined were a little bit too thick. So whether you had the pivots tight or loose or no pivot screws in at all, the handle slabs were clamped down onto the bearings just too tight and would not allow for free swinging handles. Although Max Ace has since had thinner thrust washers machined, and all the ones that got sent out since had the newer washers, or I know FLS, I think, got a whole bunch of the thinner washers in. So any of them coming from him have the new washers. I know that for a fact. Now, some guys will say bearings is like is like, you know, a cheap way, almost cheating at getting good tolerances, but I could give a shit. That's exactly what I want, is good tolerances. I don't care how I get there. Now, especially with certain Balis, I like bushings better, you know? Like, this Bali I don't feel would be the same if it had bushings. Just like this Konohishi definitely would not be nearly the same if it had bearings. You know, it's the whole package of this knife that makes it what it is. You know, but this knife from Ryworks, he's a Japanese Bali maker. I do have the full review on this coming soon, so don't worry. But I opened this and took it out of the box, and it had perfect fucking tolerances. And I haven't touched a screw on it since. I initially, made sure everything was for the most part tight when I first unboxed it, but I have not touched it since then, and it's doing pretty damn fucking well. This is how bushings should be done. If bushings are going to be done, this is how they need to be done. Now, there is one other type of bushing system which I do not have an example of to show you guys, and it's called a floating bushing system, or a floating washer bushing system, which means that the washer, instead of being the inside diameter of the washer being the same as the pivot, the inside diameter of the washer is the same as the bushing. So the handle slabs press directly against the bushing, and the washer sits over that, opposed to the handle slabs and the washers pressing against the bushing. Theoretically, it can allow for tighter tolerances, but I've never personally handled a Bali that has a floating washer bushing system, so I don't feel like it would be fair to comment one way or the other. But I hope you guys like this video. Stay tuned, because I've got the full review of the Konohishi coming up soon. Maybe tomorrow, but don't get your hopes up, guys. Peace out.